Hey everybody, it's Jen Fishburne, and we are back with the third portion of the Noah's Ark flood debate. And so this will be my second rebuttal. So I find it quite humorous that both Joel and Robert continue to try and make arguments against the standard YEC, Young Earth Creationist position for the worldwide flood, and particularly against statements that I never made. On the other hand, I am glad to see that I do have certain ideas in common with each of them. Now, if we could just mesh the truth of all three of these positions, then we wouldn't have anything left to debate over. I'm highly impressed that there are no personal attacks in this debate so far. Kudos to both Joel and Robert for keeping it professional. Well, I realize that the majority of the debates on Noah's flood surround the science of geology and other sciences. I wanted my focus to be a bit different. Scripture is always my foundation. If I can't make sense of the details of each verse in the story, then my view needs to be seriously re-examined. The questions I chose to answer in my opening statement were the typical questions we hear people ask about the logistics of the actual story. It is my contention that these details are put here to show us that it is a true story, but because it is not meant to be an exhaustive encyclopedia of the science and history of the event, we are left to determine if those events could have taken place the way Scripture describes it, without resorting to artificially classifying it into a different genre, such as mythological, or by putting limits on it that are simply not in the text, such as a local view. My first assumption is that the natural story is historically accurate, unless there is something that shows us otherwise. Now, I am not at all opposed to the deeper meaning and symbolism of the story, as that is quite evident. But the natural always points to the spiritual, so the natural must come first. This is the layer we are discussing in this debate. We could bring out the deeper truths later, as Joel has done a little bit, and as that is quite fascinating and extremely pertinent. I was going to provide a bit of scientific evidence in this rebuttal, but I decided that historical evidence is not only more apropos, but also less well known in these debates. The evidence for the science will boil down to your view of science, so even if I used all 25 pages of the whole debate to present science, I already know what the response would be. So I will let that play out on the Facebook debates. Instead, I will show in this rebuttal that history seems to indicate that something catastrophic happened to the whole world that indicates that only a flood of the proportions of Noah's could cause. Well, Robert scoffs at the size of Noah's Ark in Scripture. The reality is that we never had a flood that size either. So everything about this story is unusual. That's why they told the story. If this was a normal flood, like the type found every year in that region, there would be no purpose in telling the story anyway. Robert wanted me to address his evidence for the local flood being the Persian Gulf. I have no problem with a local flood happening in the Persian Gulf. I'm sure there have been many floods there, but was it Noah's flood? That is the evidence I am still waiting for. Jasher, chapter 2, describes a local flood before the worldwide flood. That seems to line up with Robert's version. Now, there is no such thing as prehistory. Anything that took place before today is just plain history. We have a plethora of histories from all around the world that almost always tell similar, if not the same, stories. God created man out of dirt, a worldwide flood killed all but one family, the confusion of languages, and animal sacrifices were the means of reconciliation to God. They all show genealogies that begin with men being born. They reigned as kings for hundreds of years. They did something great, and they were eventually deified as gods. The people would then erect temples in their honor, all of which have known dates, and those temple dedication ceremonies were patterned after the 7 days of creation. Each god was a sort of Adam, a prophet, a priest, and a king of his own land. He was worshipped as immortal after his life here on earth. Many were believed to have gone on to live in the stars or planets. These historical stories are literally the history of our world, and yet they have been relegated to the myth genre in so many instances. The main difference between these hundreds of different stories that all tell the same basic story, with a few differences in details, is the name of the gods. Why were there different names for all the gods if they were all true stories? Why does Jesus have so many different names? Because there are so many different languages. There is ample evidence that these stories of creation, of the flood, of great kings, of long lengths of life, of giants, and many other details of the beginning of the history of our world were all written down very early on, and were passed down orally as well from generation to generation. When people lived for hundreds of years without Hollywood, Facebook, or nightclubs, they had plenty of time to tell the stories over and over and over again. As children, the stories were memorized, often verbatim. As writers, the stories were embellished, kind of like our fake news today. We all know that Putin and Trump and Assad are all world leaders today, but we also know that not all the stories we hear about them are really true. There is nothing new under the sun. We have tons of records of these world leaders who were later venerated as gods, but they probably had their share of fake news about their leaders as well. So take the stories with a grain of salt, but the people were real. We do not have any original documents today, whether they are biblical, extra-canonical, or secular, regarding our earliest history of the foundation of this world. However, we do have those who tell the earliest stories and those who quote them as if they truly believe everything they write. We have no reason not to believe them. Many of these authors have given us very detailed genealogies, some with dates, some with reference to an event in a particular time period, as well as details about locations, how places around the world were both first inhabited after the flood, and how they were named after their king or leader who later was deified as a god. We are told in these histories why the months of the year and the days of the week were named after these real heroes and not imaginary mythological gods. We are told how many of them passed down knowledge of various trades and skills, and how those are also named after these revered humans. Well, most people have not taken the time to actually study the history of the world. We do have enough documentation and subsequent historians who based their writings upon those stories and historical data, whether written or oral, to tell a fairly detailed story, from the creation story with a man made from dirt, to a flood that covered the whole world, to the very detailed genealogies and distribution of the 3 continents that were divided to the 3 sons of Noah in the days of Peleg, all the way down to our current day. Obviously, I do not have the time or the space to give all that evidence here, but let me just provide a few quotes. Herodotus, in about 450 BC, wrote, the Egyptians first brought into use the names of the 12 gods, which the Greeks adopted from them, and first erected altars, images, and temples to the gods. The first man who ruled over Egypt was Min. When Herodotus asked a priest if one of the Greek myths was a fable, he was told, Hercules is one of the gods of the second order, who are known as the 12, and Bacchus belongs to the gods of the third order, whom the 12 produced. In these matters, they say they cannot be mistaken, as they have always kept count of the years and noted them in their registers. From the present day, 450 BC, to the time of Bacchus is a period of not more than 1,600 years. To the time of Hercules is about 900, while to the time of Pan, the son of Penelope and Mercury, is a shorter space than to the Trojan War, 800 years or thereabouts. We even have historical evidence of the city of Troy and the Trojan War as well. Eusebius, in around 300 AD, has even more exact details on these. The first man amongst the Egyptians was Hephaestus, who discovered fire for them. He was the father of Sol, the sun. After him came Agathodamon, then Cronus, then Osiris, then Typhon, the brother of Osiris, and then Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis. These were the first rulers of the Egyptians. Augustine of Hippo, in around 400 AD, quoted Euhemerus, a poet, who said that the pagan gods of the higher order were simply men whose graves are found in Greece. They were born men and deified as gods when they left Earth. We see this in Acts 12 and 17 as well. In fact, when we look at all the stories in the Old Testament about the nations worshiping other gods, it now becomes very clear to us that they are simply worshiping their heroes of old, their original ancestors and kings who were the founders of their nations and livelihoods. They thought that by building temples to them, they could access their greatness once again, as they deified them in the stars. Even Isaac Newton connected the gods to biblical figures. Hercules to Zeus, Osiris is Mizraim, Antaeus is Phut, and Busiris is Canaan, as I find by other records compared with this. There are simply volumes and volumes of historical evidence that God created the world with one man from dirt. There was a worldwide flood that devastated all but one family. Noah was a king and a giant who then repopulated the world by sailing around the world and depositing people, plants, and animals in various places. And that all the gods were actual people who descended from Noah and his 3 sons, who were then deified upon their death and had temples built and dedicated to them so that the people continued to worship them as they thought they now lived in the stars. Of course, there were gods before the flood as well, but we're just talking about the evidence for these gods after the flood, all right? Since I do not have the time or the space to devote much evidence to this, let me share a quote or two about Noah. Some of the historians you may want to study further regarding this fascinating history of our world would be Berosus, Strabo, Diodorus, Josephus, Eusebius, Herodotus, Pliny the Elder, Dionysius, Annio of Viterbo, and Richard Lynch. The books of Jasper and Jubilees also provided much more evidence for these gods being real people and that the flood was being a historical worldwide flood as well. Bill Cooper has also done some excellent work showing that we are all descended from Noah and his 3 sons. Another quote from Diodorus. In order to have a reason for destroying the whole race of mortals, Jehovah, pretended he wanted to put out the fire. He let loose the rivers everywhere, and all the human race perished, except Deucalion and Pyrrha. Hyginus said, or wrote, when the cataclysm, which we call the flood or deluge, occurred, all the human race perished, except Deucalion and Pyrrha, who fled to Mount Etna, which is said to be the highest mountain in Sicily. Just a note here, they did have different names and places, and that is probably because they came from different names and places. It doesn't make the actual story any less true. Diodorus also said, there came a flood among the Greeks, and the majority of mankind perished by reason of the abundance of rain. All written monuments were also destroyed in the same manner as mankind. Lynch, a historian who gathered his information from many sources, tells us the story of Noah. This Noah, by the descriptions of old writers, was taken in those days to be a giant, in respect of his extraordinary nature, and he was about the age of 500 years when he begat to his wife Titia his first 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and lived in Enos, the first city in the world, which was built by Cain, the son of Adam. Then he has the story of the flood that wiped out all mankind and all animals. I don't have time for that. Then Noah, then seeing himself thus left the sole king, monarch, emperor, patriarch, lord, and master of the whole universal land, found on a plain a fair pillar of marble, whereupon he carefully engraved and set down the deluge and general inundation of the world of an historical discourse. It standeth in the country of Armenia. Noah, thus living in Armenia, instructed these his children in the knowledge of sacred theology and in rites belonging to religion and holy sacrifices, as also in the understanding of human manners and secrecies of nature, of which he himself had composed many books, preserved and kept in great regard and reverence. Noah begat of his wife Titia after the flood 30 children, viz. Tuscan the Great, Prometheus, Iapetus, Marcus, and the 16 Titans, which were all giants. Also Crinus, Granius, Oceanus, and Typhoeus, and of daughters, he lists a bunch, but Pandora. Noah, surnamed Janus or Janus, or you might know it better as January. To Shem, surnamed Melchizedek, he appointed Asia. Unto Japhet or Japheth, his brother, was allotted Europe. Ham was allotted Africa. This division was confirmed by Jubilees, Aeneas, and Philo the Jew as well. As Noah sailed through all those countries, he always left people behind him to inhabit and increase in those countries. In short space, many countries were again re-inhabited and peopled afresh, which since the flood were desolate and lay naked and depopulated. Namely, he focused on populating Italy, Spain, France, and Allemagne, which became Germany. Many, if not most, of the kings throughout history can trace their lineage all the way back to Noah and one of his 3 sons. So who copied whom? No one. Noah was there, literally. He literally wrote down the history of this worldwide catastrophe, and then the story was told over and over and over again to all his descendants. Then the people's languages were divided into 70 different languages, so the names of the gods and the places were all mixed up. And then the land was divided into 3 continents, and Noah's sons were split up and they began to repopulate the world again. Population statistics clearly show that we should have about 7 billion people today if we began with 8 people after the worldwide flood. These histories and stories were all taken as history and fact until the Enlightenment period, during which it became fashionable to mock Scripture and question its veracity. Does that sound familiar? Once again, this debate boils down to what you believe about the Bible. Could it literally be true as written? Or did the meaning suddenly change in the 1700s? Again, what does the preponderance of evidence tell us? I found it a bit humorous that both Joel and Robert focus so heavily on the Watchers, which are also known in the Bible as angels, archangels, chief angels, Elohim, sons of God, sons of the Most High, gods, host, heavenly host, host of heaven, divine council, rulers, authorities, judges, princes, chief priests, principalities, powers, thrones, dominions, holy ones, assembly of the holy ones, council of the holy ones, shining ones, morning star, stars, or watchers. History shows us that a few thousand years ago, people believed that some gods, watchers, came directly from heaven, while other gods were men that were deified after they left earth. And the Bible tells us about both kinds. So let us finish this third paper with a quote from the book of Jubilees. For owing to these 3 things came the flood upon the earth, namely, owing the fornication wherein the watchers against the law of their ordinances went a-whoring after the daughters of men, and took themselves wives of all which they chose, and they made the beginning of uncleanness. And they begat sons, the Nephilim, which we call Nephilim, and they were all unlike, and they devoured one another, and the giants slew the Nephil. And everyone sold himself to work iniquity and to shed much blood, and the earth was filled with iniquity. And the Lord destroyed everything from off the face of the earth because of the wickedness of their deeds. and because of the blood with which they had shed in the midst of the earth. And just as there was more wickedness after the flood, the watchers continued to have sex with women and produced more Nephilim babies after the flood as well, as Joel so aptly pointed out in a few cases in Scripture. These stories of the gods and the giants were true stories, just as the story of Noah's worldwide flood is. Thank you.